Okay, good morning, Giddy. So, after piling on all the questions, trying to make sense of all these different versions and texts and phrasings of this one simple idea, which is that every generation we're supposed to see ourselves as if we left Egypt or re-experience that. We had the Mishnah which said, see yourself as if you left Egypt. We had Rambam and Alter Rebbe, as they cite to this idea in halacha, they say, lahara is to demonstrate oneself. And then we had a whole bunch of different questions and questions of precise wording. Why leave this word in and why leave this word out? Why Rambam doesn't say Egypt and Alter Rebbe does say Egypt? Why Rambam chooses the verse and us you took out from there, whereas Alter Rebbe goes with what the Mishnah said, which is we're supposed to tell your child on that day because of this that God did this to me. Why is Alter Rebbe quote these words from the verse? Why did the Mishnah quote those words from the verse? All kinds of questions like that, and the specific phrasing of the various different texts that are in front of us. And now we have to make sense of it. The primary question we're going to focus on first, to make it all clear, is where did the Rambam and Alter Rebbe get this idea that the halacha is to demonstrate yourself as if you left Egypt, rather than the Mishnah's phrasing, which is to see yourself as if you left Egypt. See yourself is not the same thing as demonstrate. So where did Alter Rebbe and Rambam pick this idea up from? And then this will help us clarify everything. So let's begin.
Well, the Rambam beats it up in the Mishnah.
The Mishnah doesn't say you have to demonstrate. The Mishnah says to see yourself. So where does Rambam get this idea to demonstrate yourself, which is a little change. It's a nuance, but it's very different. To see oneself means just internally. To demonstrate myself means I have to do actions that make it look like, right? So it's a different halacha. So where did Rambam get that from? So let's begin. On top of page 42 on the right side. Tabir b'chol hanal, the explanation in all the above. Bahadin, in this law, Sheber Rambam of Shulchan Aruch Admor Hazaken, that we find in Rambam and the Alter Rebbe's code, which is, quote, B'chol davadar, chayv adam laharis es atzma kihilu hu ba'atzma yata atzma b'shibet Mitzrayim, that in every generation a person is obligated to demonstrate himself as if he himself went out now from the servitude of Egypt. The word now, the word servitude, these were all words added by the Rambam and Alter Rebbe that are not in the Shulchan Aruch, that's not in the Mishnah. So in this statement, Machadesh Kamenyon, there's a couple of things that are being taught to us that's novel. A couple of new ideas. 4. What's being taught to us in this phrasing?
Machadesh?
Machadesh means that's hard to translate the word, but Machadesh means something new is brought to light.
A novel idea?
A novel idea is brought to light, yeah. That's what word Machadesh means. Okay. Literally, it means to renew.
What's the novel idea?
So it's going to be 4 points here. Let's see.
4 points, okay, coming up.
That's right.
Got it.
So here are 4 points. Novel ideas that are brought to light by this statement. In every generation, a person is obligated to demonstrate himself as if he himself went out now from the servitude of Egypt. That's the best direct translation I can give. 4 things brought to light. Number 1, Hametzias, the fact. Number 1, Vahu, and that is Shagula di Mitzrayim, that the redemption of Egypt, is a continuous action. It's a continuous happening that happens for all generations. That's number 1, just the fact, before you do anything about it. First of all, we have to know this fact, that the exodus from Egypt is not a one-time event, but it's an ongoing event that exists in every generation. It happened once, yes, but its effect, its reality, on the halachic level, we're not even talking the spiritual level of escaping materialism that we spoke about from Tanya. On the very halachic level, on the very basic reality level, the fact that we left Egypt is a continuous truth. How is that?
Hence the see ourselves as.
Oh, wait a second. That's already an obligatory thing. Now we're talking about the fact. In other words, there could be one-time events that happen once, and that's the end of it.
But isn't that the basis of?
It's the basis for point 2, which is our obligation. But first of all, the fact. The premise, which is that the exodus from Egypt is not a one-time event, but a continuous one. And then there's the obligation, which is going to be point 2, as we'll see. So that's number 1, just the fact that the exodus from Egypt is an ongoing reality. Why is that? Key, because, now quote from our Mishnah / Haggadah, if God were not to take us out of Egypt, us, our children, ubnei baninu, and our grandchildren, mishubadim ayinu lefav Mitzrayim. We would be subject to this servitude to Pharaoh in Egypt
To this day?
to this day.
Wow.
How we understand that is a good question, and we learn about the Haggadah. All the commentators are not going to discuss that, but this fact remains
Crazy.
that had we not left Egypt, we would still be slaves. So the fact that we aren't in slavery is an ongoing exodus. It's not like a one-time thing, and if it didn't happen then, it would have happened 100 years later, it would happen 20 years later, it would happen 500 years later. If it didn't happen then, it wouldn't happen, period. So the fact that it happened is a continuous reality. We're always indebted to the fact that we are not slaves in Egypt on an ongoing reality basis. So the fact that we now are in a state of freedom, because the effect and the realities of the exodus of Egypt still extends till today. So that's point number one, the fact that the exodus is an ongoing reality. Now, point two, hachiyuv, our obligation. Considering that it's an ongoing reality, the obligation we have toward that is different than if it were a one-time event. Meaning, and this is, in addition to the obligation to make mention and to remember the exodus of Egypt every day, which you were talking about, both at night and at day, when you remember something, the obligation to remember Egypt is to remember something that happens to our forefathers too. So if we're a one-time event, then our obligation would end at remember. Remember what was, because it is a fact of what was. But because now we're learning, no, it's not a fact of what was, but it's an ongoing activity. So now the obligation is more than just to remember an event of the past, but it's to know the event in the present. That's a different obligation. So there's now an obligation on the person, literally to see himself, meaning lahargesh, to feel, as if he himself now left Egypt. Those are the two words that were added by the halacha that wasn't in the Mishnah. That he himself now. Mm-hmm. That's the novelty here. By the Mishnah telling us that in every generation the exodus is renewed, the obligation now becomes beyond remember what was, but to see yourself as if it's happening to you now. So that's number two. Point one is the fact that it still continues. And point two is because it still continues, our obligation is not just to remember a past event, but to feel its present truth to me now. Now comes number three.
I wonder what Gimel has to say.
The obligation to demonstrate that. So the first thing is the fact that it still exists today. Number two is, because it still exists today, my obligation is to feel that existence today. Number three is to demonstrate it.
So the first two are really in line with the Mishnah at this point.
That's right.
Now we have the demonstrate part, which is Rambam.
Which is added by Rambam. Let's see how we got there. But we're going to see how they build on each other, and that's how, even though the Mishnah isn't stated explicitly, Rambam and Alter Rebbe pick it up because of its.
They pick up the nuance
because of what's being built here.
Explicitly in the Mishnah, but it's
exactly.
There.
So let's see. That's right. That's right. Hachiv de laharis. Number three is the obligation to demonstrate this fact. And this is she'ein maspik she'adam yira. It's not enough that the person sees, yargish, feels, ba'atzmai within himself, as if he himself now left the exodus from Egypt. He also has to demonstrate this feeling. Point three. Point four. We're clear so far in our points? Yeah. Four. This obligation to demonstrate, etc. As if he himself now left the servitude of Egypt, is not just whilst you're retelling the story. All the activity of that night must be demonstrative of this feeling. That's another point. So in other words, point one is the fact that it still continues. Point two is, therefore I have to feel it. Point three is, therefore demonstrate it. But when do I demonstrate it? And that's point four. And everything I do tonight's got to demonstrate that feeling. That's point four of this halach. Behind this means to say, even though we say in the Haggadah, in every generation, etc., as if I left Egypt, And earlier in the Haggadah, we say, etc. If God did not take us out, that comes from Avodah Mayinu. If God didn't take us out, we would still be slaves. Nevertheless, even though you stated the fact that every generation we have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt because every generation would have been stuck had it not happened. We said that. Is that not enough of a demonstration? Just my verbalization of it, by explaining it, by telling it? No, that's not enough. Even though the retelling of the story is actually to retell it to another, so there's a demonstration there in the fact that I'm telling it to those assembled, which is part of the obligation to tell it to another, which we already learned about in our Gemara, and which everybody's going to talk about soon. Mm-hmm. Right? We learned in our Gemara this idea that it has to be to another.
Yeah.
So that
even to yourself if you're alone.
Even to yourself if you love to treat yourself like another, listening to the story, right? Which we're going to talk about soon also. And everybody's going to talk about that soon, coming from our Gemara. Right? So that, in theory, could have been the end of the obligation to demonstrate. Because I am demonstrating it by verbalizing it. But it comes as halacha and says, no. Everything else you do also have to demonstrate your freedom. Eating and drinking. Leaning to the left. Setting up a table with lots of silver and gold. All the stuff we learned about in halacha and in the Gemara. In order to express and to manifest this feeling, as if I myself left Egypt, everything I do that night. Okay? So we have 4 stages of one idea. The fact that it continues, and therefore the fact that the Exodus still continues, therefore our obligation is not simply to remember, but to feel like it's happening now. Now that feeling must be demonstrated, and that demonstration is not just enough to verbalize it and tell everybody, but to actually behave in accordance with that feeling. Those are the 4 stages here. Clear?
Sounds like Rabbi Gimbal. You dig, you research, you find.
Okay. Based on this will be understood. Mashar Rambam on the left here by Zion. Yeah. Based on this will be understood. Mashar Rambam that which the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe. They required to quote Gam, also the verse which reads, remember that you were a slave. That verse is not cited in the Mishnah at all. Not in any version. This verse, and remember that you were a slave.
In Egypt?
Yes. The context, yes, in Egypt, the part in Egypt, right, which Rambam doesn't quote, but Alter Rebbe does quote. Mm-hmm. But the context of this verse we learned way back is not about actually the Seder. The context of that verse is, treat your slave nice because remember you were a slave.
That's right.
So this remembrance you were a slave has nothing to do with the night of the Seder.
Rambam decided
to quote it, which is one of the questions they've asked.
Because he didn't have the
right, but of all the verses, that's right. But of all the verses to demonstrate this halacha that you have to demonstrate your freedom tonight, why would you quote a verse that's unrelated to the night of the Seder? There's other verses related, right? That was one of the questions they've asked. Now that was going to answer that. Why was it important to quote this verse, which is remember you were a slave and therefore treat your slave nicely?
That's very good words, wisdom.
Right, but why are we quoting that verse here when we're trying to tell us how you're supposed to behave at the Seder? Explains the Rebbe. So now we know why they quote this verse. And it's not enough to quote the other verse, which Rambam quoted, which was, and us you took out of there, or the other verse, which the Mishnah / Alter Rebbe quote, which is, tell your child because of this that God did to me that we left Egypt. Those verses aren't enough, even though those verses are speaking of the night of the Seder. Alter Rebbe and Rambam decide to quote another verse, which is, in general, remember you were a slave. Why? What do these verses indicate? The verses that say, and us you took out of Egypt, or because of this that God took me out of Egypt. What does that tell me? Hirak ala Metzias. That only tells me point 1. It tells me the fact that Egypt, the Exodus, is an ongoing reality. That the Exodus from Egypt, he pulled in Mshechas B'chol Davidar is a continuous activity of every generation. That's all these verses tell me. Because of this God did to me. Okay, so I know what happened to me. And us you took out of Egypt. Okay, so I know that it happened to me. But those verses don't indicate that because it happened to me, therefore I'm supposed to feel like it, or certainly even to demonstrate it. Those verses just state the fact.
Those are the verses, sorry, those are the verses that the Mishnah is quoting.
That's right. The verse that the Mishnah quotes,
Okay, so we're not.
or Rambam quotes because his Mishnah doesn't have any
He
have
quotes
any verse.
something else. Another
Only
verse.
state. Sorry.
He quotes another verse not related.
In addition to that, they quote a different verse, which is, remember you were a slave, and therefore treat your slave
Treat your
nicely.
slaves,
And that's the part that's going to
Ah,
be the linchpin
that-
for the demonstration.
Because the other verses which talk about the night of the Seder just state the fact. It happened to me. It happened to us. But it doesn't tell you that there's any obligation as a result,
Not point two.
or even to feel or to demonstrate. It doesn't say anything.
Point three.
Doesn't say point 2 or 3 or 4. It stops at point 1, which is the fact that it happened. That's happening to me. How's that? In theory, this fact that the exodus from Egypt happens in every generation, one could in theory say, look, it happens in every generation, but your obligation is only to remember the way it was to our forefathers. You don't have to go from point 1 to point 2. You can stop at point 1. It happens in every generation. Good. And what are my obligations?
No, but point two is okay too, because point two is just seeing yourself.
That's right, but it's not
It's not a demonstration.
it's the point 2 is not a imperative, inevitable outcome of point 1.
I thought it was.
Well, it flows logically, but it's not absolute. In other words, it flows logically that because it happens to me, therefore my obligation should be to feel. But in theory, we could say, look, it happens in every generation, but we can't expect you to feel it. What we will ask you to do is to remember what was. That, in theory, could have been the obligation. Right? So let's continue. I think this will address your point. This parentheses right now, bottom left. Even though the word which says, because of this that God did to me, that those words are part of what the verse says, you shall tell your child, right? Tell your child, because of this that God did to me. That's why we're doing this whole thing tonight, right? That's what the pasuk says to do. Likewise, that's the verse the Mishnah and Alter Rebbe quote. Likewise, the verse that Rambam quotes, which is Vayisanu Haitzim Misham, and us, you took out of there, Babahemshich, comes in continuation, Lamasha Lakasa Lifnezeh, in that which the verse says earlier, Vamartel Banecha, you should tell your child. Okay, so I guess that's your point. The verse is telling you, tell your child what happened to you. Is that not an obligation to see as if it happened to you? So says the Rebbe, no. That's only a question of retelling the story. That the way you tell the story is in such a fashion that you're talking about it in the first person that happened to me and us. But it's not absolute. Therefore, I don't have to conclude that I'm supposed to internally feel as if I now left Egypt.
Because you're just retelling a story.
I'm retelling a story in the first person.
First person.
But to obligate me to feel a certain way,
for you. It's just
I have to feel that way. That's a whole other obligation. The Kolchkin, much more so. And certainly, I'm not going to derive from there that everything else I do tonight has to be imbued with the feeling that I left. The verse just says, tell the story in the first person. That's it. And therefore, the Rambam and Alter Rebbe have to add another idea, which is they add this whole part, which is not in the Mishnah, which is quote, and of this God commanded in our Torah, remember you were a slave, as if you yourself were a slave, and therefore treat your slaves nicely. That whole part's not in the Mishnah, right? But the Rambam and Alter Rebbe add that. Why? This commandment, which is especially since it's been repeated, and you shall remember, is not just to remember what happened to our forefathers. It's also of this idea. Remember that you were a slave because it happened to you. God took us out. God took me out. Right?
That's in some Chumash. Love you, fill a man.
What do you mean?
What I mean is that he's saying treat your slave better than the way they treated him in Egypt.
Right, but here the
That's
point.
love your fellow man.
Yes, that's true. But the point here is not love your fellow man. Love your fellow man can exist even if we weren't slaves in Egypt.
Yeah, yeah.
Here the point is, remember that it happened to you. Right? Not just retell the story in the first person as if it happened to me, but remember that it happened to you. The verse adds that. It's a new verse. Not just tell the story in the first person, but remember it happened to you.
So what's the purpose of point one?
Sorry?
What's the purpose of point one?
Well, you cannot have
If
point.
you can't-
Okay, you cannot have point two without point one, but you can have point one without point two. Right? Point one is the fact that it happens every generation.
Yeah,
Point two is
wasn't that
see
just-
myself that
wasn't
way.
that
I
the-
cannot see myself that way if it didn't happen today. But it could be it happened today and I still don't see myself that way.
Okay.
Right? Point one can exist without point two, but point two cannot exist without point one. Follow?
Point two cannot
Exist without
have
point one. But point one could exist without point two, certainly. Point two, which is to feel as if it happened today. That can't be unless it actually happened today. But in theory, it's possible that it happened today, but I don't feel it. So point one could exist without point two. And the fact that Torah says, tell the story in the first person is only indicative of point one, that it happened today. Not indicative of the fact that I feel that way. But the other verse, which says, remember you were a slave, that adds something new. Not just remember that it happened to your forefathers, but you remember you were a slave. Now Torah is telling you to feel a certain way. Right? See?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah.
Yes, I was hung up on point two.
Which is
What is point two again?
that I have to feel as if it happened to me. Not just that a fact that it happened to me.
But
It's
point
possible.
two
Yeah.
is not, doesn't derive from point one necessarily. So we
No,
have-
it's not necessarily.
but
It needs
although
it needs point one to exist, but it's not an outflow of point one.
It needs point one to exist.
But it's not a direct outflow of point one. In theory, point one could exist
Only the verse
standalone.
that's added by Rambam really gives weight
Oh,
to
that's right.
point two.
Exactly. This new verse that Rambam introduces, which says, remember you were a slave. Now it tells us, oh, remember what we told you in point one? Remember we told you got to tell the story as if it happened to you in first person? Now we're telling you to remember that and feel that way. Right?
Mhm.
So that's what everybody's going to say now. Bottom right. Now that we know from the verse which says, remember that it happened to you. The person is obligated to remember and to see himself. Because of you yourself left Egypt. We now learn from there. Now we learn point three and point four. Pesach. This obligation to see yourself as if you yourself were the slave. This obligation on the night of the Seder is not just to see yourself internally, but also to demonstrate, and that this obligation, that's point three, and point four, and that this obligation is not just when you tell the story, and even when you are enjoying yourself, as will be explained soon. Right? So we have one verse which tells us the fact, and therefore tell the story in that manner. A new verse, Rambam Al Teber introduced, which says, remember this happened to you, tells you to feel a certain way. This fact that the Torah tells you to feel a certain way leads us to the conclusion, as we'll soon explain, that this feeling must be demonstrated, and not just demonstrated when you tell the story, but also when you behave throughout the rest of the night.
I could just see a kid.
So let's see.
I could just see a kid saying, "You're that old, Zadie."
Yeah, so good. Let the kids ask that. So let's see. There's a big question. You with me? Bottom right of Ches. We'll go through Ches and then we'll leave Tes for Monday. So few more paragraphs. So there's a big question. You made reference to the fact, and we just spoke about this earlier, that a person is obligated to make mention of the Exodus from Egypt every single day.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big question in halacha, which the Rebbe addresses in his Haggadah. We spoke about this once in our Haggadah Shirim in depth. What makes the obligation of telling the story on the night of the Seder different than the obligation to tell the story every single day? So there's all kinds of answers to that. One is, for example, on the night throughout the year, all you have to do is make mention. The night of the Seder, you got to be more elaborate. Right? There's all kinds of different answers as to what makes the night of the Seder different if you anyways have an obligation to remember every single day. One of the main answers is the following. One of the additions in the commandment to tell the story of the Exodus, the Leil Tazvav B'Nissen, on the night of the Seder, al mitzvah sliras yitzis b'chol yom, above and beyond the obligation to remember and make mention of the Exodus every single day, who is the Gadat Lebincha, the telling it to your child. Hainu, meaning to say, it's not enough, as it is every day, that you make mention of Egypt to yourself. You have to tell it to your child or to some other. We fulfill the obligation of remembering Egypt in the third paragraph of Shema. And you don't have to tell it to anybody else. It doesn't have to be in an other form. It's just remember it. But in the night of the Seder, there's a unique mitzvah here. Other. Tell to an other. Right? V'zeu atam. And this is the reason, top of the left of 43, l'masha amru, to that which we said in our Gemara, in our Mishnah. Shebein lo ben isha, if a person doesn't have a son or a wife, this is the point you were saying, Yeshua. Sheishalu oisai hu shal atzmai. If he doesn't have a child or wife to ask, he's got to ask himself. Because in the night of the Seder, the obligation is to tell the story to another. Therefore, if I have no one to ask me, I got to ask myself. I have to treat myself as if I were the other. Have a dialogue. And the fact that I ask myself, I become an other to myself. Don't have an argument, but dialogue. And by answering my own question, I'm telling the other that's in me that's asking. I'm fulfilling the obligation to retell. So now says the Rebbe, what do I have here? What does that mean? It means the Torah is telling me the entire premise of tonight's remembering of the story is an engagement with other. Therefore, anything I'm supposed to see about myself, what am I supposed to do with that? Demonstrate it. Because the whole mitzvah tonight is to tell it to another. And therefore, derived out to Rabbi Rambam from here, the obligation to see yourself inevitably turns into point 3 to demonstrate. Because the whole night of the Seder is about telling it to another. This he says. Since we find in this detail, with respect to the remembering of Egypt, that in the night of the Seder, there's this new phenomenon that it must be told to another. We derive from here, from the Rambam, in the Rambam and Alter Rebbe's position, on the totality. Because the story must be told to another, this teaches us that the totality of my experience tonight must be in relation to another. And therefore, and therefore this detail, this fact, that I must see myself as if I left Egypt, that also has to become to another. To demonstrate it. And the same thing is true of all action of tonight. In other words, so there's 3 steps here so far. Number 1, there's the pasuk says, tell the story in the first person. That means it's an ongoing reality. Number 2, Torah says, remember you were a slave. Now Torah is telling you, oh, that thing you told your kid about that happened in the first person, you got to remember that and feel that way. Then Alter Rebbe and Rambam say, well, Torah told us that tonight there's a unique feature that what you tell must be demonstrated. Mm-hmm. Demonstrated, it means everything you're feeling and everything you're doing must be demonstrative of what you have to, must be demonstrated. And therefore, when we told you, you remember you are a slave, that links up with the obligation for you to tell, because everything's got to be for an other. Everything has to be projected. And therefore, this feeling you have that today I left Egypt must be projected in everything I do tonight. And this is the steps of how the Alter Rebbe how the Rambam and Alter Rebbe went from our Mishnah, which just says the fact that I should see myself as if I left Egypt. But from there, they derived, culling from these different verses and these different principles, right? The verse that says, it happened to me. The verse that says, remember and therefore feel. And the verse which says, tell to another that my feeling that I left Egypt must be demonstrated to another in everything I do. How beautiful is that? Okay, God willing, on Monday, what?
How complicated it became.
Right, but now actually it got simplified now.
Yeah, now it's simplified.
That's the point, it's simplified.
But how they went through all the
Yeah,
details.
We simplified
I
it.
guess the word demonstrate is reflected by having to explain or express it to somebody
Correct.
else.
That's what makes tonight different.
That's what makes the word demonstrate.
Correct.
Demonstrate by nature
implies an other.
You have to.
That's right. Even if the
You
other is
don't
myself.
demonstrate per se to yourself unless you're talking to yourself.
Exactly. So even if it's right, demonstration means I'm doing it to myself as if I were an other. Right?
Yeah. Good.
Right. Let's imagine a scientist. Let's imagine a scientist who theorizes about a certain formula. Right. So he wants to demonstrate it.
Usually
So
we'll have to show it to his
a colleague who will
his
critique him.
investors, yeah.
So either to a colleague or to investors who will critique him, or if nobody else is there, he demonstrates it. And when he demonstrates it, he behaves as if he never heard the theory in his life to watch it to see if it works. So he treats himself as if I'm an other. So in a demonstration, what I'm doing is I'm putting myself in a position as if like I'm on the outside watching this thing to see if it works out. Right. So the same thing is true of how if I have no wife or child to ask me the questions, I got to ask it to myself. Hey, Levi, why are we doing this tonight? Well, Levi, the reason is because, right? So the same thing is true by demonstration. I'm leaning to the left because I want to show myself to myself of how I'm freed. Because that's the whole uniqueness of tonight.
Perseverance of these guys.
So it becomes a whole beautiful package. God willing, on Monday, we'll now revisit some of the details of the Rambam's language and the Alter Rebbe's language to see why they each choose these language, these wording, and especially the Alter Rebbe, which added the word for Egypt, which Alter Rambam did not. So we're going to get to that, God willing, on Monday. A wonderful day and a good in Shabbos.
If Egypt would have